To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was the most dishonorable death a man could face in Tudor England, a punishment reserved for the worst traitors. But for Silken Thomas FitzGerald and his family, the sentence from King Henry VIII was more than just a punishment. It was a performance. Henry wanted a spectacle of suffering, a public warning carved in flesh and bone. So, what could a 24-year-old Irish lord have possibly done to provoke such a savage and personally crafted end from the most powerful king in Europe? This is a story of rebellion, a fatal misunderstanding, and a death far more brutal than you've been told. In the bloody theater of the Tudor court, few stories are as tragic as that of Thomas FitzGerald, the 10th Earl of Kildare. History remembers him as Silken Thomas, a nickname that brings to mind images of youthful vanity, supposedly from the fine silken fringes his men wore on their helmets. He was described as hot, impetuous, brave, daring, and chivalrous youth, filled with the fire and confidence that came with being part of Ireland's most powerful family. For centuries, the FitzGeralds of Kildare had been the dominant force in Ireland. They were the uncrowned kings, an Anglo-Irish dynasty so powerful that London had to rule through them, not rule over them. But by the 1530s, that delicate balance was about to shatter. Across the sea sat King Henry VIII, a monarch whose paranoia and obsession with absolute control were growing by the day. Henry was in the middle of his great religious schism, breaking away from the Pope in Rome, and he had no patience for powerful lords who acted like kings in their own lands. The FitzGeralds, with their vast private armies, weren't just subjects, they were a threat. And in Henry's world, threats weren't just managed, they were eliminated. This is the story of how a rash act of defiance met the cold, calculated cruelty of a king. The stage for this tragedy was set in 1534. Thomas's father, Gearoid Og FitzGerald, the 9th Earl of Kildare, was a master of Irish politics who had navigated the treacherous Tudor court for years. But his enemies finally got the king's ear. The Earl was summoned to London, accused of treason. Before he left, he appointed his 21-year-old son Thomas as vice-deputy to govern in his absence. A fatal decision. With the Earl locked away in the Tower of London, rumors flew. Then forged letters arrived in Dublin with devastating news. The Earl of Kildare had been executed on the king's order. For Silken Thomas, this lie was the spark that lit the fuse. Heartbroken and believing he was next, he chose vengeance over caution. On June 11, 1534, Thomas made his move. At the head of 140 of his finest horsemen, helmets adorned with the famous silken fringe, he rode to St. Mary's Abbey in Dublin. There, before the stunned royal council, he committed an act of spectacular defiance. The Lord Chancellor, Archbishop Cromermur, begged him with tears in his eyes to reconsider. But as Thomas hesitated, one of his family's traditional Irish bards began to chant, praising his ancestors and calling on him to avenge his father's death. The moment of doubt passed. Thomas threw the ceremonial sword of state onto the council table, renouncing his allegiance to Henry III. "I am no longer Henry Tudor's deputy," he declared. "I am his foe." The rebellion had begun. At first, the rebellion was a success. As vice-deputy, Thomas already controlled most of the English-held fortresses and their weapons. He rallied a large force and laid siege to Dublin Castle, the heart of English power in Ireland. He demanded that anyone of English birth swear loyalty to him and the Pope, or leave the country. For a few months, it looked like he might actually win. But the rebellion took a dark turn with the murder of Archbishop John Allen. Allen was a hated rival of the FitzGeralds and one of the king's most important officials in Ireland. When the siege of Dublin started, he tried to flee by ship, but his vessel ran aground. He was captured and dragged before Silken Thomas. Pleading for his life, the Archbishop knelt before the young lord. Thomas, perhaps feeling a moment of pity, is said to have ordered his men in Irish to take this fellow away. His guards, however, either misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted the command. They fell upon the archbishop and brutally murdered him. The murder of a high-ranking churchman was a catastrophic mistake. It turned a political rebellion into a sacrilegious crime, earning Thomas and his followers immediate excommunication. In London, Henry VIII was enraged. He dispatched Sir William Scuffington with an army of over 2,300 men, the largest English force sent to Ireland in 150 years. The tide of the war turned. In March 1535, Scuffington's forces besieged May Castle, the main stronghold of the FitzGerald dynasty. After days of bombardment with heavy artillery, the castle's garrison surrendered, but there was no mercy. The captured soldiers were executed to a man in an event that became grimly known as the Pardon of May. The message was clear: rebellion would be met with utter annihilation. One by one, Thomas's allies deserted him. For months, he was a fugitive, hunted across the very lands his family once ruled. Finally broken, he surrendered to the new Lord Deputy, Lord Leonard Grey, who also happened to be Thomas's uncle by marriage. Grey gave Thomas a solemn promise his life would be spared. Trusting this pledge, Thomas FitzGerald was taken to London to face the king's mercy. The mercy Silk and Thomas expected never came. Once in London, he wasn't brought before the king. He was thrown directly into the Tower. The promise from Lord Grey meant nothing to Henry VIII. For over a year, the once proud Irish lord languished in a cold cell. A heart-wrenching letter he wrote survives, pleading for money for clothes. I have had neither hosen, doublet, nor shoes, nor shirt, but one. And so I have gone barefoot and bare-legged, but that poor prisoners of their gentleness hath sometime given me old hosen and shoes and old shirts. This wasn't the treatment of a nobleman awaiting a pardon. It was the slow, deliberate humiliation of a traitor marked for death. While Thomas shivered in the Tower, the state's legal machine ground on. An act of attainder was passed, declaring him and his family guilty without a trial and stripping them of all their lands and titles. And the king's revenge didn't stop with Thomas. In a move of shocking cruelty, Henry ordered the arrest of Thomas's 5 uncles, James, Oliver, Richard, John, and Walter FitzGerald. Even though some of them had opposed the rebellion, their blood was enough to condemn them. The king wasn't just punishing a rebel. He was systematically exterminating the FitzGerald leadership. On February 3, 1537, the final act began. Silken Thomas and his 5 uncles were dragged from the Tower of London to Tyburn, the notorious execution ground for traitors. For a nobleman, being executed here was the ultimate dishonor. They were all sentenced to a traitor's death to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The gruesome process was a public show of terror. First, the condemned were tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged by a horse through miles of filthy streets. Next came the hanging, but the goal wasn't a quick death. They were cut down while still alive and conscious. Then the executioner would slice open their abdomen, pull out their intestines and organs, and burn them in a fire as they watched. Finally, the victim was beheaded and their body hacked into 4 pieces, quartered. This entire horrific process was carried out on the 5 uncles. For Silken Thomas, Henry VIII made one tiny, almost meaningless concession. He was only hanged and beheaded. His body spared the final indignity of being quartered. The butchery at Tyburn was not the end. The severed heads of the FitzGeralds were mounted on pikes on London Bridge, a grisly and constant warning to anyone who dared to look up. Their dismembered limbs were sent to be displayed in prominent towns, a declaration of the price of treason. The impact in Ireland was profound. The FitzGerald dynasty, which had dominated Irish life for centuries, was shattered. Their lands were confiscated, their power dismantled overnight. Henry VIII hadn't just defeated a rebellion, he had used it as the perfect excuse to fundamentally change how Ireland was ruled. The old system of governing through powerful Anglo-Irish lords was finished. London would now move towards direct rule, a policy of conquest and colonization that would define Anglo-Irish relations for the next 400 years. A few years later, the Crown of Ireland Act 1542 was passed, and Henry VIII was declared King of Ireland, cementing this new, harsher reality. Despite the king's viciousness, the FitzGerald name didn't vanish entirely. Thomas's young half-brother Gerald was smuggled to safety on the continent by loyal supporters, ensuring the family line survived. But the era of the FitzGeralds as the uncrowned kings of Ireland was over, brought to a bloody and spectacular end at Tyburn. The story of Silken Thomas is a brutal lesson in power. A young man's rash act of rebellion was met with the disproportionate and calculated cruelty of a king bent on absolute control. The execution of Thomas FitzGerald and his 5 uncles wasn't justice. It was a political statement written in blood. It showed the world that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of Henry VIII's wrath, and that the Tudor state would use unimaginable brutality to enforce its will. It was a dark turning point that set the stage for centuries of conflict and resistance in Ireland. What do you think? Was Silken Thomas a reckless fool or a tragic hero? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories from the dark side of history, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the most brutal events of the past.